Hello, and welcome back. For this week's podcast, we're joined by Lucy Radford from the Sumatran Orangutan Society, who is speaking with us about their work to protect the critically endangered species. Lucy explains a range of new and exciting ideas being applied to conservation contexts and the projects being implemented with local people to develop communities sustainably on their terms. If you like this episode and want to follow more of this project, please follow the links in the description. And if you'd like to support us, you can make a donation at restoreourplanet.org or follow us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Enjoy the conversation. Hello, and welcome back to Restore Our Planet podcast with me, your host, Jack Cole. So today I'm joined by Lucy Radford from the Sumatran Orangutan Society, known as SOS. So Lucy, welcome. Start with telling us a little bit about your background in primate conservation and how you got into your work.
Hi, thanks for having me on the podcast. So I've been working in the sort of broad primate conservation area since 2011. I did an undergrad degree in biological anthropology, and in that I found so many fascinating things about non-human primates and as well about sort of human evolution, and that sort of directed me a bit towards primate conservation. But the real tipping point for me was I went to volunteer at a monkey sanctuary when I was in my second year of uni, and that just from that point onwards, I thought, yeah, I definitely need to work with monkeys or apes. And then, 2010, I did a master's in primate conservation in Oxford, and that kind of directed me more towards the human element of conservation because, you can't separate sort of conservation and people. They're so interlinked, and my favourite parts of my masters were where we were learning about the history of conservation and its effects on people and how important it is to be inclusive of local and indigenous people when conducting conservation projects. So when I graduated from my masters, I knew I only ever wanted to work for projects which had that at the forefront, really. So for 5 years, I worked in Morocco on a macaque conservation project, which was absolutely amazing. Really loved it. But it was on a voluntary basis because they're just sort of operating on a shoestring. So I was sort of doing that alongside temporary jobs. And then in 2018, I saw a job advertised at SOS, went for it and got it. So I've now been with SOS for 4.5 years. And yeah, just the more I sort of work at the charity, the more I keep learning about the dynamics of conservation and how, you've got to always be, prepared for anything to change. And conservation is affected by, like anything, is affected by politics. It's affected by global events. So yeah, really just sort of learning about how dynamic it is, and the fascinating sort of projects that can come out of global events. So that's my background.
Fantastic. You mentioned there that sort of human society and conservation are very much interlinked. I sort of went on a bit of a similar sort of journey myself. I just thought, oh, I'll just stick to animals, sort of leave people alone. But you suddenly realise that, as you alluded to there, that you sort of get into economics and resources and, of course, forestry and things. So, what are some of the ways in which you found that both sort of overlap in such crucial ways?
So I think a big thing is sort of the links between conservation and colonialism. And I saw that a lot. So when I was doing the masters, we looked a lot at conservation in African countries. And I read quite a lot of papers on, the old sort of fines and fences approach, and very much pushing people out and keeping the wildlife for rich people to hunt, for example. That's very reductive, but it's sort of a simple way of explaining it. And that narrative is very much still present. We in our strategy at SOS, we have decolonizing conservation as a major thread. Everything we do has to be, we have to be very mindful of the fact that a lot of traditional conservation was born out of colonialism, and just looking at the way that we can affect change without perpetuating those problematic sort of those problematic overtures, really. So that's one huge way in which it's linked, and one thing that I think the conservation sector as a whole is really moving towards is trying to not replicate the errors of the past and to take into account local politics, national politics, learning a lot more from local expertise rather than always flying in literally expertise from elsewhere. So yeah, that's a real crossover. And I think there's just so many. To me, the human wildlife interface is so fascinating, and I can't imagine why people wouldn't want to to look at it. I'm a member of an IUCN specialist group for human primate interactions, and that is just, the research going on in that is so fascinating about how humans and wildlife kind of interact and intersect. So yeah, I think I've gone off on a slight ramble there, but
No,
there's so many crossing points. So
no, that's really interesting, actually. I think that leads on quite nicely. I just wanted to ask, what would be a less colonial way of doing conservation in a modern, environment?
so I think it's just being really it's working with local and national people and governments and organizations, um, and really listening is one of the massive things, is not assuming that you know best, just because you come from a registered charity or a big NGO. It's so important to really put in the slow, careful work to understand what people need. And unfortunately, that can be quite hard to do when you're restricted by funding timescales and people want quick results. But ultimately, that's not how it works. So what we're doing now is we're trying to do more program-based work rather than project-based. So we've got these long-term goals in mind, and we know from the start that it's not going to be quick to achieve those goals. It takes weeks, months, even years of collaborating with communities, earning trust, finding the right people to work with and the right expertise in the area, doing those ongoing ecological and biodiversity surveys alongside it. So there's that element of it as well. It's avoiding that kind of sticking plaster approach of, well, we've come in, we've got this much money to fund this area, and we've decided this is what we're going to do, and we'll do it, and we'll leave after a year, and that's the end of it. That, we're not doing that. So yeah, there's people way more qualified than me to speak on decolonizing conservation. A lot of researchers who are really at the forefront of it, but yeah, in the SOS context, it is doing the slow, careful work, and listening.
Okay, well, that's good. So, moving on from there, would you mind telling us a little bit about the background and history of SOS? So, founded in 2001, and how Lucy Wisdom, I believe her name was, got basically essentially from where she started to where things are today.
Yeah, so as you say, it was founded in 2001. Lucy Wisdom was traveling in Indonesia, and she encountered orangutans at a rehabilitation centre. So it was orangutans, primarily infants or young orangutans who had been rescued either from maybe the pet trade, or their mothers had been killed, and they were being taught by humans how to climb, how to sort of be orangutans again for eventual release into the wild. Of course, orangutan babies are incredible to watch, and they really captured her heart and her imagination. But she could see that the rehabilitation of these infant orangutans was only a tiny part of the puzzle, and she wanted to set up something that took in all aspects of conservation. So education was a huge thing for her. She from the start worked with, I think there was at one point something called the Orangutan, which was like a mobile education thing that went around to schools in Sumatra. She was really keen on educating people in the UK as well. So, and we still have a sort of schools program and everything like that. And it just grew and grew from there. For a long time, it was very small. There was sort of one permanent member of staff, sometimes two for a time. We've now got 4 staff in the UK, and another sort of 5 or 6 working remotely from Indonesia and other areas. So it's growing. It's going in the right direction. We're working with incredible experts in Indonesia, and it's thanks to years of support from really loyal donors. We've got corporate partnerships that really enable us to grow our work, and they do give us that funding that means we can do, as I say, do that slow work. They're not asking us to produce results in 6 months. They're saying, let's fund you for 3 years and you tell us what you need. And that is absolutely crucial for the kind of work we want to do.
Brilliant. And onto the orangutans themselves, what is their current reality on the ground, sort of regarding threats and trends and their population numbers and etc.?
Yeah, so in Sumatra, there's 2 species of orangutan. There's the Sumatran orangutan itself, which there's around 14,000 left in the wild. And there's also the Tapanuli orangutan, which was described by science in 2017. So it's the newest species of great ape sort of known to science. It's estimated there's about 800 of them left. So obviously very low numbers, but there's a huge amount of really good work going on to try to increase the population, well, to aid it to increase by protecting the habitat. The sort of trends, so in terms of the forests, I think there's this perception globally that Indonesia is just losing forest really quickly. That's not necessarily the case anymore. The Indonesian government has some really strong policies in place to keep forest standing. I read an article last week that deforestation from palm oil has dropped massively recently. So there's a lot of good news and a lot of good work going on. The big thing and something that we're really focused on is sort of making sure that orangutan populations can reach each other, because going back to the early 20th century when sort of colonial influences cut down forest for tobacco and rubber, way back then that sort of started pushing orangutan populations apart. And there's a lot of opportunity to create forest corridors and to allow the populations to reach each other again, which obviously aids in genetic diversity and sort of the future health of the orangutans of Sumatra. So that's something that we are really sort of invested in alongside our partners in Indonesia and with support from forestry authorities and the government of Indonesia as well. So yeah, over sort of the last 100+ years, the population has declined, but it is stable where it is at the moment, and we have all the right tools. When I say we, I don't just mean SOS, us and our partners and all the other people working in conservation for orangutans. We have the tools and the information we need to really, to make sure they can thrive in the wild. And I use the word thrive quite deliberately because I think survival implies they're just sort of hanging on. But thriving is, those populations being connected. They can move around, they can breed easily with this sort of big genetic pool.
Brilliant. And so moving up to now the sort of current era, what's going on at the moment. What influence have current events had, if any, on the state of things in Borneo and for your organisation? Of course, time of speaking, war in Ukraine, post-pandemic, those sorts of things. What influences have those events had?
Well, the pandemic had a huge effect, particularly, or really up to about this time last year, because of course, a lot of there's a lot of money that comes into parts of Sumatra in terms of tourism, particularly tourists coming to see the orangutans. Obviously, that couldn't happen when international flights were cancelled and lockdowns were happening. So that presented quite an issue for people who are employed in sort of as forest guides or taking people to see the orangutans. So we actually ran an emergency appeal in 2020 to raise money for. So initially, the first phase of it was to provide food parcels for people who had just lost their job overnight, effectively, because the lockdowns were happening. We didn't know when they would end. We didn't know when tourists would be able to come back to Sumatra again. And the second phase of that was called Forest Friendly Livelihoods. So the same people who we'd supported with the food parcels, they went on to work with a local contact of ours called Dharma. He runs a project called Nature for Change. And he has helped people to sort of to plant fruit trees in the buffer zone around one of the main national parks. So it provides an income for the people who plant the trees because they can sell the fruit. And it also provides more of a sort of green corridor for orangutans and other animals like monkeys to move around in. So it's sort of a win-win, and it provides an extra income for people. They get paid to help plant the trees, and they can also harvest some of the fruit as well. So that was, COVID sort of made us have to very quickly come up with those sort of approaches. But and it also meant that up until, as I say, up until about this time last year, a lot of our field projects had to be put on hold because it just wasn't safe for people to be visiting remote villages where people hadn't been vaccinated, hadn't necessarily been exposed yet. But with rates are sort of falling, I think, in Indonesia, and we're sort of back to being able to go and do all the work, or our partners rather are able to go and do all the work on the ground that they have been wanting to do this whole time. Other events, I think the major one, which I'm sure comes up in every interview you do, is the climate crisis. Of course, anything that affects global climate patterns is going to affect rainforests, is going to affect orangutans. And whenever people ask me, oh, what can someone sitting at home in the UK do? It doesn't sound glamorous, but it is that basic stuff of, contact your MP about climate policies, try to reduce your use of fossil fuels within, your own personal capabilities. Vote with your wallet. Don't buy things from companies that are trashing the planet. It sounds very simple to say, but it is these sort of added up collective actions that ultimately conservation organisations all over the world can do so much. But if the climate continues to change at the rate it is, then we'll reach a point where we can't do much more. So I think that's the really, really big one, is the climate crisis, and we all do have the power to affect change on that.
Of course. And Lucy, now just going back to the very beginning of your journey, what were some of those really formative experiences that you had with primates that really inspired you? Like some real kind of, face-to-face, anecdotes or something that you personally went
Yeah.
through that made you think, that's it, that's the journey for me.
I think one of the biggest ones for me was going to South Africa in 2010, and I was helping a PhD student gather data on a troop of wild monkeys that were up in a mountainous region in the north of the country. And while sort of sitting waiting for the monkeys to pass, an entire troop of baboons came past, and the first thing I could smell them before I could see them. They have a really sort of musky kind of scent to them. And I sat there thinking, well, I probably should be afraid, but there's nothing, I'm just up here on this mountain with them. I'll just sit still and they'll just go by. And they went by almost as if they hadn't seen me. And just seeing them in the wild in that big troop, that, no cars up there to sort of run them over, no people feeding them junk food, just it was just a real moment of, wow, I'm so lucky to see this. And I suppose it's been a few moments like that of just seeing any primates going about their business in the wild, and
That's
it's just amazing, really.
brilliant. Okay. And Lucy, where would you like to see things sort of head over the next 5 to 10 years?
Um,
Specific to orangutans, I should say. Sorry, not generally in life and
just
buy
generally,
a new house and things.
yeah.
But yeah,
So I think I'd like to see the current sort of positive trajectory keep going. There's a lot of amazing people and amazing organisations working really hard to ensure that orangutans can thrive in the wild. And I think, yeah, I think there's a strong chance that will keep going. It's just, yeah, we need to keep keep the momentum up and keep reaching the people who can support us. And as I say, I know banging that drum again, but going back to the climate crisis, it is, I want to see a lot more action on that, and not just from individuals, but corporations as well. So yeah, I'd like to see a lot. Yeah, the sort of small local stuff. I'd love to see that continuing, and it will definitely, with our partners and the work we're doing. Yeah, and I'd love to see I just can't wait to see how that pans out in the next sort of 5 years, and where those projects will go, really.
Brilliant. And Lucy, where can people support you and follow you and your work and your organisation?
So our website is orangutans-sos.org, and there's loads to read on there, loads of information, and lots of sort of examples of things people can do. And then we've got all the social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn and YouTube. If you just search Orangutans SOS or Sumatran Orangutan Society on those platforms, then all our details will come up. And yeah, we really like it when people sign up to our email newsletters as well, because that's sort of where you get the really meaty information that you can't fit in a social media post.
Lucy, thank you for your time.
Thanks a lot.